If you've been following this show, what you know about us is we like to delve into topics that are related to business. People owning businesses, people working in business, people having to manage others in business. But anything of a professional nature is it's no holds barred. It's what we get into. And today we're going to get into a topic that has been in the forefront for probably the last 3 or 4 years. It's something that has a fair amount of controversy hooked to it. And we're going to do our best to basically weigh the pros and cons and help you understand not only what it's doing, but where it's going. Stay with us. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Smith. I'm joined with Travis Smith. Today, that mysterious topic that I alluded to is DEI. It's diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it has been kind of woven into the fabric of most major and medium-sized businesses around the country. It's not something that everybody has, especially a good understanding of, or maybe a good even impression of. But we're going to do our best today to kind of unravel that and talk about where there might be benefits to it, where it's definitely sabotaged other things, and try to give it a balanced look. So, Travis, I don't know what your thoughts are on DEI or whether you've done anything in your own business with this, but I'd certainly like to get an understanding of what do you think about when you hear the term DEI?
This is such a hot button topic right now in the media. And pretty much every major broadcasting channel is covering this, including podcasts like ours, obviously, Joe Rogan, stuff like that. That being said, it seems like most people fall in either one of two camps. One side is DEI, like how could we live without it, right? It's
Hmm.
such an important vehicle to make sure that organizations are run and operated correctly, taking into consideration, making sure that opportunities are given out fairly and using the language that's used there with equity, right? Now, the other side of the fence, it's funny how I don't really come across a lot of people who fall in between these two, but the other side of the fence looks at DEI at times as uh, this vehicle that's ruining business and or forcing people into doing things that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily agree to on their own. So, I don't necessarily know if we need to get into the, which one's right and which one's wrong thing. But I think what is interesting is what's the impact that's happening to businesses today? Because one of the reasons I brought up this topic is in the last 3 months, we've seen upwards of a dozen Fortune 500 companies peel back and get rid of their DEI programs.
Right,
So
right.
I think that that's interesting. Again, regardless of what your position is with DEI, I think it's interesting to try to understand why these organizations brought them in the first place. And then now, just a couple years later, why are they repealing them?
All right. So I think one of the reasons that we're seeing this change in how DEI is being accepted and applied is because when this thing first came about, it was introduced into society and the business community more of as a compliance-driven edict. Okay, you need to start doing this. There will be penalties if you don't. And so people were kind of having to absorb it in a manner of, I don't agree with this. I don't know that it's right for my business, but I don't have a choice. So I think it kind of started there. And over the last couple of years, as people have come in and people have left, like you're going to talk about, I think it's gone a little bit away from that feeling of we don't have a choice to we do have a choice as to how we apply it and what parts we take out of it that might actually be good things to do in a business. So I definitely think we're living through kind of a transitory position. A lot of it's driven by politics, no question. The former administration was almost blind to what it was really all about, and the one now is being a little more critical. But I do think there's a transition afoot.
Well, and like a lot of policy, when the starting point, the foundation of that policy that creates vehicles like this, like DEI, I want to believe most of the time that the foundation of these policies is for good measure, right?
Hmm.
That it's going to legitimately help society, help people, help business, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, and I don't really have to be frank, the reasons as to why this happens. It's an interesting phenomenon, though, which is sometimes some of these policies just end up kind of coming to life on their own, and they get so bastardized in the process that the original intent and the original foundation for what its purpose was has been long left. And what you're saddled with then, months, maybe even or years and decades later, is something that's completely different than what the originators thought of.
Right.
And, you know, DEI, the funny thing is, it certainly had its heyday in the last couple of years, but it's not new, right?
No,
I
it's
mean,
not. I mean, in fact, for those of you who don't really know the origin of this, the premise of this whole thing actually got started back in the early 60s, when government initiated the Civil Rights Act and other things that came along in the 70s. It's just kind of, it's percolated along and now it's been given an official name. But the roots of this thing didn't just start with COVID or George Floyd or any of those other kind of landmark things that changed society. You're right. I mean, it does have a foundation that goes way beyond, the last 5 or 10 years that most of us can recall.
and I remember when I first started running into policies that, would be kind of framed up under DEI or EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission,
Right.
was affirmative action. So
Mm.
I started looking into colleges kind of like that late part of 90s, entered into college kind of shortly thereafter. And that was my first opening segue into, I guess today, what we really refer to as DEI policies
Right.
was through affirmative action.
Right.
And
Yeah.
back
That's all
then,
part of it.
right, but the whole idea back then, affirmative action was really focused heavily within the colleges. It certainly had its part within employment, but it was a really big focus within college administration.
Oh, in terms of applications for who
Correct.
you're going to allow. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea there is it's leveling the playing field for all individuals that are applying, right? Which, again, I think there are bits and pieces of the foundation of that idea that have some merit. The issue becomes when we swing so far in one direction, whereas we kind of are today, for example, with affirmative action, or maybe backtrack a year ago, which is if you're a certain race, you just can't even get in, right? So it's kind of like this idea. Like I had somebody explain it to me this way. This was a while ago. Because if you have 1,000 people that are applying to become physicians, right? What I want to believe is that the best people for the job become physicians. Well,
Right.
why is that, right? Why not talk about accountants? Well, with physicians, it's a little different. Physicians, the impact that they have directly to an individual could be quite severe,
Hmm.
providing medical advice, surgery, so forth,
Right.
medication. So this idea of affirmative action, while I think its underpinnings or its foundation might have had some merit, it's interesting how in some areas, bringing back this short story on physicians, where it got pulled so far in one direction that you had people who were top of their class who had all the right background and experiences and credentials and still weren't getting the job because they came from either the wrong socioeconomic background or the wrong ethnicity. And that's where when I view these type of policies, that's the failure of it just moving too far in one direction.
Well, okay, so I agree with you, and I think part of that is basically woven into the fabric of how we developed as a nation. I mean, when you go back and look at the Constitution, the Constitution basically has two parts to it. What the federal government is responsible for, and then what's everything else is relegated to the states. And the whole idea for doing that was if you had 50 states out there all trying different versions of things like petri dishes, eventually you'd come up with solutions that everybody would adopt because you've kind of gotten the best of the best. So I think over this long period of time that we've been around, the whole idea of let's put it out there, let's push it sometimes, most of the times, way beyond its useful conclusion to try to figure out where the optimum point is and what we should adopt going forward and maybe what we let go of. The problem with DEI today, I believe, is that it's shrouded in so much political, political kind of force feeding and other elements that suggest favoritism going in different directions that people are looking at it, they're almost like saying, okay, I don't want any part of this because, it's basically no good. Whereas if you break it down and look at some of the elements, there are some practical, good elements of it that most businesses probably should be doing.
Well, and the thing that I love with the general idea of, um, I don't know if affirmative action is the right phrase, but really more just supporting kind of, the phrase you hear is kind of the have nots, right?
Hmm.
Is I love the idea that, so STEM education is a good example of this. What you'll typically hear is that if you go into inner cities or if you go into areas that from a socioeconomic perspective are a little bit lower from an income standpoint, is they don't have the same opportunities as, especially as it relates to STEM. And that's why I bring
Right.
that. So I love the idea that through programs like this, you can bring in that type of education, knowledge, and technology to make sure that those children, as they're growing up, are being introduced to that so that ideally, especially if they have interest in it, that they have those opportunities to pursue that going through school, right?
Right.
So in that particular instance, I think that's a really powerful uh, opportunity that comes as a result of policies like this.
Hmm.
The thing though that I find that becomes interesting is, and you had used the word a moment ago, it becomes political, is when these large scale movements underneath the pinning of DEI, for example, really start to get some traction. So for example, like back in, I think it was 2018, 19-ish, you had the Me Too movement.
Hmm.
And then kind of 2020, you had Black Lives Matter movement.
Hmm.
What ends up happening with these movements is they just get this, it's like this giant gust of wind going through a turbine. And what it ends up doing is it creates all of this just perhaps in a way kind of madness on both sides of the fence.
Right.
And what it ultimately does, in my humble opinion, is distorts the real meaning and opportunity. And the funny thing is that happens in that moment is what it ends up doing is it actually ends up hurting the people it was meant to support down the road, right? Because
Yeah.
now what's happening today, perhaps, and this is where we can take the discussion at this point, is you're seeing all sorts of DEI programs in major organizations, Fortune 500 companies, being dismantled at this point.
Right.
Walmart was one of the recent ones that just happened about a week or two ago. You had Harley Davidson was another one, McDonald's another one, um, the Coors Company, Lowe's.
Now,
So
okay, so for these ones that are offloading this, and I don't know to what extent, if they're just offloading the department or the consultants, or they're just completely disbanding with the philosophy, do you, because I don't know, do you know why they've chosen to kind of put this aside or walk away from it?
yeah, there's not one answer to that. So it's a complete mixed bag. So we'll take Harley Davidson as our first example here. Uh, I happen to own a Harley, so I consider myself a supporter of that organization.
Right.
It it's similar to the situation that happened with Budweiser last year. You have an organization that starts making decisions for one reason or another. Perhaps it's because they feel from a political perspective that they have to. We got to remember these organizations are tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue every year. So they have to, unfortunately, at times be somewhat mindful of the way the wind is blowing. Well, all it takes, in particular with the Bud Light situation, is one individual to make a decision and have the company get behind and be like, yeah, that sounds great. But what ends up happening is they're losing sight of who their core audience and core customer is,
Right.
right? So there was the big boycott that happened with Bud Light. The reason I bring all this up is because not to the extent of Bud Light, but Harley Davidson had the same thing happen to it,
Well, so
right?
did Target. Target was another one that suffered a lot because of the length to which they took it, which I would say in a lot of these large organizations, sometimes the feeling of having to adopt it is being kind of pressure cooked by a small group of people that are saying society needs to change. You have a voice in society. You need to
Right.
pick up this mantle and run with it and help us force feed society.
Right. So one of the things that I have seen, Harley Davidson being the example I'm using here, is they got rid of it because they identified that interesting choice of words there. They identified that uh, that policy was not in alignment with the values in which the company should be perpetrating in support of its customers,
Hmm.
right? So in that particular instance, hats off to them. They made a decision. It didn't work. It wasn't the right one, but they did what was right and they changed course to be in alignment with who their customer base is,
Right,
right? This whole phrase of like, you can't make everybody happy, right?
right,
But what you should be trying to do is make your customers happy,
right,
right?
right.
So that was their situation. Walmart is an interesting one because the reason they chose to abandon their DEI commitments as of recent was financial.
Mm,
They found that as a result of the policies that they were pushing and or being involved in,
right.
that it was actually losing the company money.
Mm, interesting.
So
Interesting.
they at one point, Walmart, I think had I don't know, like 2020, give or take, had given up about not given up, had donated or put into for the cause about $100 million over a 5-year period towards DEI.
Hmm.
Right. So, anytime you're talking about that many zeros on the back end of something, what you would like to think is that people are paying attention thereafter to how that money was used
Right,
and is it moving the needle on the other end?
right,
Well, look, I mean, at the end of the day, these large companies, they're businesses. They're not in business to lose money.
right,
So if something's not working, it may take them a while to figure that out, but eventually some of these companies come around to determine that, hey, that this wasn't the right thing for us.
right. All right, so look, let's spend the rest of our show today talking in this particular direction because one thing I will admit is when you hear DEI, you're listening to somebody talk about DEI, you read something about DEI, the first thing that pops up in my head, and probably a lot of people similar to me, is this is a political poisonous pill. Nobody asked for it, or at least the business didn't. The business has to do it. They have to suffer the consequences. It's just shrouded in all the political stuff that nobody likes. And so it automatically has a very negative tone to it. But if you take the title, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, and you park it aside for a minute and you look at downstream of that, what are some of the elements that businesses could benefit from? What are some of those elements? What aspects of this do you think are smart things for most businesses to do?
So, look, what I can tell you, given our industry, so we work in the life sciences industry, in particular medical device, but we're on the technology side. It would be foolish for a company of any size to not hire a diverse background of people. Now, look, to be clear on what I mean by that is diversity in thought, diversity in experience, diversity in background in terms of education, schooling, product, right? And then, yes, of course, diversity from a nationality or ethnic perspective, because
Right.
that can be helpful,
Right.
right? That's so important in product development because the diversity of thought, which then comes from a lot of those other items, can be very helpful in product development.
Mm,
So that's one area where I can see, the idea of diversity, which is not the old wooden ship as talked about in Anchorman. Uh, it's a good thing, right? The problem becomes once we start putting metrics behind it, and those metrics force us to make certain decisions, then all of a sudden what you find is you have companies gaming the system. And so I have a short story on that. The company will go, I'm not going to name the company because it's a very large company. However, there is an organization that is on the financial side of things, very large organization, 100,000 plus employees. I know someone intimately who works there, and I found out not too long ago that when you think of a minority in terms of a person, did you know that there are certain classifications within quote unquote, air quotes, I'm a minority that don't qualify for that anymore?
No, I didn't.
So let me give you two examples, right?
God, I can't wait.
So in this organization, again, a Fortune 500 organization, hundreds of thousands of employees,
Right.
they do not consider people, men or women, from India or China a minority. Do you want to know why?
Why?
Because those folks in that industry are not economically hurting. And there is a lot of them in that industry, in particular IT, software development, and so forth. So the funny thing is, even within this framework of DEI, in that particular organization, the goalpost is constantly moving as to what that even means. So it's not even consistent. So one year, one group of people, quote unquote, are considered minorities, but the next year they're not. So it's this
Because if they've
constant.
reached a certain threshold of representation or reward from doing the work that they were hired to do and they're successful and the company now says, yeah, we need more of these folks because they're really good. Once they've reached that level, they're not considered disadvantaged or
That's right.
marginalized anymore.
Correct. Yeah,
Interesting.
so it's really interesting on that end. And again, so your question earlier was where could some positive things come from this? And
Hmm.
I had outlined just hiring diverse people, the difference between hiring a man versus a woman, right? Um, but you got to be really careful with this stuff because if your policies are not supportive of your employees, are not supportive of your business and your
Hmm.
customers, you really need to take a hard look at that and second guess the decisions you're making and why you're making them.
Right. Right. And you know what? I was going to go to the same area of initially of hiring because the probably the best approach, if everybody could do it legitimately, would be you hire the best qualified person for the position, irregardless of where they came from or what they look like or any of that kind of stuff. Even though that fundamentally goes against the grain of human intention. We all like to be around people that look and sound like us. And more and more people are adopting the idea of a diverse surroundings is more is more in liking than seeing sameness. But you have bias that plays out every single day with every decision you make. And if you're not on guard, you're going to lapse into what's comfortable, not what's effective. And so I do think in the hiring area, that's certainly where it needs to start in terms of making sure that you're protecting the company by having the best team of people possibly to provide whatever product or service you're in the business to offer.
Well, on this discussion of DEI kind of hiring, one of the policies that came out, I think, don't hold me accountable to this, but I think it was 2019, maybe 2018, was that I believe it was specific to Fortune 500 organizations that they had to have at least one woman on their board of directors.
Right.
Do you remember that ruling
Yep.
that came out?
Yep.
Now, I think if I recall correctly, that ruling was actually disbanded in California, kind of 2022-ish, give or take.
I thought the Supreme, and I could be wrong about this, but I thought the Supreme Court took that up and actually ruled against that as a dictum that that it had to be done to meet some type of federal or quota system of some kind. But you might be right. It might just be California because I think California was the one that started that.
Well, so that's a good example of what we're talking about today, which is a policy like that, such a broad, sweeping policy is, I understand the intention behind it, which is a company by its nature, if it's diverse in terms of its thought and its actions and its approaches, is almost always going to do better. And that has been my experience than companies who are not. right?
Hmm.
But at the point in which we start levying governmental actions on businesses like that, what you're going to find is two things are going to happen. You're going to have people push back just because they don't want to be told what to do,
Right.
or they're going to play along with the system in a way in which it almost kind of bastardizes the policy to begin with,
Or
right?
it kind of adds an air of tokenism into the
Correct.
process. Yeah.
Right. And so as a result of that, it undermines the whole piece to begin with.
Right.
I think, when you live in a fair market society, it should be the marketplace that dictates that. And what I mean by that is if you are interviewing with a company and you find out that their board is all men and you don't like that, well, then you shouldn't go work there, right? And so by the policy of the business, that's what should dictate their success, right?
Yes, but I will say to that that probably a little less today than before. At one point, the percentage of opportunities in businesses was so small because most businesses had that arrangement, that setup that kind of precluded people from even wanting to try because they saw this immense wall of white old guys. And so when you have a preponderance of industry looking like that, that's where you have to say, all right, what do we have to do to crack that? Because evolutionary wise, it's not making much movement.
And look, I certainly don't discount that. I see that in my own industry today, right? So there are other ways though to address that issue rather, in my opinion, again, forcefully requiring businesses at a certain level. And most of them, look, we're talking businesses that are doing $100 million plus
Right.
easy, right? They're publicly traded companies. So uh, I just think at the end of the day that if you want to be the best business possible or the best leader, more often than not, what you're going to find is diversity of thought is a good thing, right?
Well, I also think that that bodes well when you just look at your marketplace,
Right.
especially like we're here in Southern California. I mean, the marketplace is very, very ethnically diverse. In our own city, we have a huge population of people from various Asian backgrounds, from various Middle Eastern backgrounds, from Hispanic backgrounds. I mean, it is truly a mini melting pot, and businesses here would be foolish to say, well, I don't want to serve those people, so I'm going to have a staff that only looks like and is interested in serving people that look like me. Because then you're cutting out a massive amount of the marketplace, of which many of these people they have money to spend and they want products like what you offer, but they're not going to get them from you. They're going to get them from places that seem more like they have people in there that look like them, that understand their needs and their background. So, I just think it's smart. It's a smart business practice to really get in touch with your marketplace, your customer base, and figure out how do we serve the most people by arranging our staff of good working high quality folks that can help these people attract them to us.
So, what would be your, I guess, your thoughts or your perspective on today? If we have folks that are listening to us that are either A, small business owners, or B, in management, what's your thoughts on either A, how do they deal with DEI in their own organization, or B, how do they attract the best people? Because that's kind of what we've been talking about a lot today.
Right. My guidance, my suggestion would be that number one, you understand the principles of DEI, the stuff below the surface of the title and all the political crap that comes with it. Understand the elements of it and figure out what parts of those will enhance your organization. Make sure that your human resource folks are well versed in those areas without necessarily being billboards for the political side of trying to, drum up support for it. Really dig a little deeper and just say, how do we go about looking through the marketplace for people who can really do this kind of work that we want, irregardless of where they come from? What it might mean is you have to change your practices in terms of where you go look for recruiting for talent. That might be one thing to do. But I really do believe if you put your arms around some of the core principles and walk away from the window dressing, I think you'll end up with a better culture in your company and more people that look at you as a good place to work because you've actually taken it to heart and put it into practice, not just tried to serve the pressure points that society brings on you.
I agree 100%. And the reality is, you don't need a policy or a program in your organization in order to do that.
Right,
Right. Now, what I will tell you though is, uh, in the event you don't have a policy, which I'm not advocating for one in the first place, but I do think it's important if you are in a leadership role or you own a business to educate the other people who would be involved in your hiring practices
right,
on the importance of trying the best that you possibly can to remove that bias that you referenced earlier, right?
right.
Um, because that could be a potential roadblock. The other thing too, though, is and I may be in lonely quarters here by saying this. It's never going to happen, so this is wishful thinking on my end. But I would just love to see a day where companies stopped getting involved in politics. You know, I just don't need to hear I had brought up Harley Davidson before. I own a Harley, right? So I am a customer of theirs. You know what I don't need to hear from Harley Davidson?
What?
I don't need to hear which president they're voting for, or
Right,
what their stance is on world wars, right?
right,
I don't need to hear that kind of crap.
right.
And more
Yeah, look,
importantly, I'm not going to you for that type of content. I'm going to you for a freaking metal horse burning some rubber on the road, and a good product, right?
right. Well, okay. So, and look, I understand that, and I tend to look at companies I do business. Are they honest? They have integrity. Do they deliver what they're promoting they're going to deliver? Is it a good quality product? If I have an issue, do I get quality support to help me through it? That's all I care about. But there is an appreciable amount of society today, many of them of younger generations, but plenty of them in later years, that now attach, is your company treating your people fairly as a means of me deciding whether I'm even going to consider doing business with you? And
Sure.
that's growing. And so I think most smart companies have to consider that, because if they don't, and they don't make reasonable, moves forward to help improve their own cultural organization, if they don't do that kind of stuff, they're automatically telling that segment of society, F you, we don't care about that.
Right.
Now,
Right.
with Budweiser, I'm totally fine with them saying that because they lost $1.5 billion, and I don't think Bud Light is ever going back to number one 2 years later. So I would be
Wait.
totally fine saying, "Hey, screw you guys, we're never doing that again," because they
Well,
took a
hold on.
massive, massive hit over that.
Wait, time out. $1.5 billion, that's what it ended up being.
Yeah, they lost massive amounts of money on that.
Well, but again, I'm not advocating for what happened there. But what I am saying is that's a really tough lesson to have to learn, in fact, of, don't lose sight of who your customers are,
Right,
right?
right,
If that is the number one thing that moves your business forward, is understanding who your customers are and then providing a service or a product that meets the needs of those customers, then I think you'll do okay,
well,
right?
and look, the other
All this
one.
other crap that we've been talking about all today is just window dressing.
Okay, that's a great word to use, because I was just getting ready to say Target, and I don't know how much money they've lost over this, but they took it to a fairly high level, their DEI approach with some of their apparel selections in stores, and they got a massive amount of kickback and protesting and boycotting and all this other, getting smeared on social media. But I think it's because they went away from just using the elements of DEI to better how their organization operates. And they took it into the battlefield of what the consumer was deciding to make decisions on, and they stuck it in their face. It was like window dressing, and people just said, I don't need that." And so they kind of fell prey to the whole thing as well. So I think in some of these cases, whether it's Budweiser or Harley or Target or any of the rest of them, when you take these kinds of, these kinds of I'm searching for the right word here. These missions, and you get to that kind of a radical extent to prove to society that you've bought on, there's going to be backlash, and you've got to decide how much of it you're willing to absorb.
Yeah, we've kind of at least I brought up the whole Harley thing and what I want to see from them and what I don't want to see from them. But there's another thing that we've not talked about yet because we've really been talking about businesses, but sports is another area of this
Right.
where I have seen a ton in the media, both video as well as articles, talking about the change that sporting events have gone through. So, for example, I would never say I was a diehard fan, but I loved basketball. I would always be happy to sit down and watch a game,
Right.
especially if it was a Lakers game, given where we live. But back in 19, 20, 2021, I was like, you couldn't get through 5 minutes of a game without some political notion coming up or political perspective, and it just kind of became maddening to the point where I stopped watching the NBA entirely because of it. Because
Yeah.
like, there are certain, at least with the way that I operate, it's like I just don't need that kind of stuff put in my face at all points of my life.
Right.
Like, I use sports as an escape to enjoy myself, right? And so I think that's maybe a cautionary tale for folks is there is, in my opinion, a time and a place where perhaps that's appropriate. But if
Okay, so you're
everything
oh,
you're
all right. So what you're talking about there, and what we've kind of alluded to with some of these other examples, are metrics which can quantify the benefits or the consequences of going down this road. And what I can't tell you sitting here today is, are there any really solid metrics of companies who have benefited by going down the road to that length? I don't know. All you hear about and all you read about are people who have stepped in it and suffered the consequences. I don't know who has actually gotten, major measurable benefits by adopting these practices and taking them outside the four walls of the business.
Okay, so as we've been talking, because I just had to share this real quick. I went to fact check you, so that was kind of fun on
Okay.
your Budweiser comment. So you were correct. So golf clap, 1.5 billion, but try to guess what the value in the business that was lost, right? Because the 1.5 billion was just sales, right?
Yeah, the only aspect of what you're talking about that I was made aware of was Bud Light was at one time the number one selling beer in the United States, and that it dropped, it lost its position. I think Modelo actually took it over for a while, but I don't know about just overall company value. I have no idea.
So listen to this. I'm reading from an article that came from CNN. In the US, Bud Light sales dropped 10.5% in revenue and nearly 30% in core profit. So that's the 1.4 billion
Hmm.
during the second quarter. This would be of 2024. And here's the kicker. You ready for this?
Yes.
Leading to a nearly 40 billion loss in value of the company.
Oh my God. Oh my God. All right, so right there is a great example of when you go beyond what is probably reasonable to show that you're supportive of a change in doing business, what can happen. It doesn't mean you shouldn't figure out what parts of this will work for your company and put you on better footing and do a better job of attracting and serving the community you're in. But there's clearly a line where if you go over it, disaster is going to ensue.
Well, and I'll this will be my last little snippet, and then we can kind of close things up here. But did you recently? It just happened about a month and a half ago. The Jaguar commercial. I mean, you were at one point a Jaguar owner, so
Yes, yes. That
you
was
are
back when British Ford owned them. It wasn't when Tata owns them now. So what
right.
is it?
So they put out a commercial, maybe November, early December of 2024. The commercial, if you just saw it on face value, you didn't see the beginning where they showed their logo, and you didn't see the end. You would have no idea the commercial was about a car at all,
Hmm.
and was just very vibrant. And I'm trying to do a PC way of describing this commercial, but it has had a disastrous effect on the brand
Wow.
because again, You have an organization that is making decisions either to be avant-garde or because they feel like they need to kind of move into the next, whatever it is, right? And, we're guessing at this point.
Right.
But it's unfortunate when you see the outcome where the decision doesn't land as it was hoped.
Right.
And in some cases, I don't know if this will happen with Jaguar, but it ruins the business.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of it is structural ruination that the company might get back on some kind of steady ground, but they may never get back to whatever prominence they held before they made that decision.
And I think maybe, the takeaway here in this discussion today, and to be clear, is neither one of us have said that DEI is a terrible thing. I think the way that it's being operated in many instances is probably not great. But the bigger takeaway here is if you're running a business, whether you're the business owner or you're a leader within the business, understanding the value that comes with just diversity of thought, let's just leave it there, right, is such a powerful thing in business. And if you don't understand that, you're missing out on an opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. All right, guys, thanks for being with us today. Hopefully, you got something out of this somewhat tumultuous conversation over a concept, a societal concept that's probably been received well in some quarters and has had less than desirable effects in others, but that you can make your own decision about what parts of the diversity, equity, inclusion movement will serve your company and your employees and your customers the best. So thanks for being with us today, Travis. This was a great topic. We probably should get into more of these kind of things, and I'm sure we will coming up. So stay with us because every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we come out with new material that will help you be a better business professional, business owner, or somebody operating in some level of business where you've, paved the way for your career and you want to just show up doing your best. So thanks for being with us today. Take care. We will see you in a week.